good morning to you all. I am delighted to be here amongst such a big gathering of fellow human rights defenders. And thank you very much for inviting me to speak at this important conference. I've been asked to give an introduction or overview of the right to freedom of religion or belief, or religious freedom, as you said. But before I do that, let me just take a moment to tell you about the work I do as the UN Rapporteur. As a UN Rapporteur, my task is to monitor the implementation by states of what is called the 1981 UN Declaration on the Elimination of All Forms of Intolerance and of Discrimination based on Religion or Belief. And this declaration is the most detailed account in the UN system of what is entailed by the right to freedom of religion or belief in terms of what rights states ought to respect, protect, and promote. And the way I do my monitoring is to produce 2 thematic studies a year, looking at different aspects of this right, to undertake 2 country missions of a fortnight duration each to 2 countries who would let me in each year, to write as many advocacy letters as I have time to do so in behalf of victims who have their rights violated or about to have their rights violated, and to engage in as many activities as this one, where my time will allow me to do so, to promote understanding about the right and to network people working in this area. So that is what I do as the UN Rapporteur. Now, having said that, let me start my remarks today by talking a little bit about the international legal basis for this right. I call it the right to FOB, to make my life easier, freedom of religion or belief, because I do not think the term religious freedom adequately conveys the meaning of the right of freedom of thought, conscience, religion, or belief. And also, of course, there are groups, I think, especially in the US, across the pond, who use the term religious freedom to be synonymous with claims to religious privilege, to claim exceptions from laws protecting against discrimination. So I just want to insist that I use this phrase and that people be mindful that we talk about a very, very, very broad right. It's also important because if you look at the way the right is enshrined in international law, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Article 18, and the Article 18 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the failure to include the terms thought and belief has important implications for those who want to have the right protected, and also for those who claim the right to be synonymous with religious freedom, claiming that this right protects primarily religious people rather than all human beings. So I think it's extremely important, both in its descriptive and prescriptive capacity, to use the wider term freedom of religion or belief. Also, the belief aspect of this right is extremely important for those who don't profess a religion, for humanists, free thinkers, rationalists, atheists, or agnostics. But I'll get to this broader element in a moment. So the legal framework, and to quote Ambassador Charles Malik of Lebanon, who was one of the penholders of the Universal Declaration, the human person's most sacred and inviolable possessions are his mind and his conscience, enabling him to perceive the truth, to choose freely, and to exist. According to Ambassador Charles Malik, if the protection of human dignity was not to remain a dead letter, this was one of the core principles that had to lead the work of the committee entrusted to draft the declaration. What Malik was referring to is today known as the Forum Internum of Freedom of Religion and Belief, whose inviolability is well established under international law and represents the absolute component of the right to religion and belief, as enshrined in Articles 18 of the Covenant. In other words, there can be no interference under any circumstance by the state or anybody else in our forum internum, in what we hold in our minds to be our ultimate beliefs and thoughts. The right, therefore, includes the right to have or adopt a religion or belief of one's choice. As observed by the UN Human Rights Committee in General Comment 22, this entails both the freedom to choose any religion or belief as the one to replace one's current convictions. Just as freedom of thought, conscience, and religion or belief protects the right of the individual to follow a religion, it also protects the right to reject any religion or belief, to identify as humanist or non-religious, and to manifest non-religious convictions through expression, teaching, and practice. Whilst this fundamental right includes the right not to reveal your beliefs or religious identification, and the right not to take part in any religious ceremonies, it also includes the freedom to argue for those beliefs in public and to seek persuade others to the merits of your beliefs or the flaws of theirs through debate, discussion, and criticism. Interestingly, the freedom to convert revealed to be the most controversial aspect of the right during negotiations of the covenant, and some states still today have in place apostasy laws and criminalize conversion from the country's official religion to any other belief system. Apostasy laws therefore constitute a clear violation of the forum internum, which enjoys unqualified protection even in times of public emergency. Freedom from coerced conversion is an element of the protection entitled to the freedom of holding a belief freely chosen. Prohibited acts of the state under this provision include penal sanctions, threats of physical force, policies that aim at compelling or facilitating an individual to adhere to a specific system of belief or recant their own. States also bear the responsibility to protect individuals under their jurisdiction from similar interference by third parties, be they family members or members of society. Let me now turn a bit about limitations of this right and the accommodation that may be called for in regard to this right. Whereas the freedom to hold a belief of one's choice is an absolute right, the freedom to manifest that belief, either individually or in community with others, is a qualified one. Limitations can be adopted when they are prescribed by law and are necessary to protect public safety, public order, public health, public morals, or the rights and freedoms of others. Now, limitations are a very tricky business. It's an important area, and I know the NSS are very keenly committed to working in this area. It's a very important area. Last year, I wrote a whole report on the links between religion and state, and part of that looked at times when the right to equality and non-discrimination comes against claims to religious freedom. In other words, how do we negotiate the space between the rights of everybody and the rights that some religious orders claim? In short, these limitations have a high threshold and must be very narrowly constructed. They must be very clear in terms of when a person may actually trigger that border. The forms of manifestation protected are those linked to worship, observance, teaching, and practice. And a more detailed list, of course, of these rights are found in the 1981 Declaration, as I mentioned. The Declaration entails, for instance, observance of religious holidays, of dietary rules, the wearing of religious symbols, and acts integral to the conduct of religious groups, such as the freedom to elect religious leaders, priests, and teachers, to establish places of worship, and others. So a detailed listing of these rights are found in Article 6 of this declaration. I think it will be useful to look at what are the permissible limitations and exceptions to these rights. Now, I would argue that institutions that open their doors to the public to provide services, whether for lodging, catering, or healthcare, should not be able to claim a religious exemption to rules furthering equality of public health. Any contrary rule would permit the institution to impose its faith or the leaders of the institutions, their faith, upon others with resulting harm to health, equality, and dignity. And I shall insist on this principle every time I speak about the accommodation that has to be offered on account of religion. Institutions that provide goods or services to the public, of course, differ from churches, synagogues, mosques, temples, and other houses of worship. In those institutions, the rules of the faith are typically being imposed only on those who have chosen to accept or at least explore the faith voluntarily. By contrast, government officials, such as clerks charged with issuing marriage licenses, should not be afforded an exemption from laws advancing equality. And this is true even if the objector can be accommodated such that the person or couple can be served without being aware of the objection. Any accommodation of a government official, even behind the counter, puts the imprimatur of the government on the discrimination and should be disallowed. Of course, outside the government context, individuals should be accommodated where doing so does not result in harm. Consistent with this principle, expressions of faith manifested in appearance should be accommodated absent a showing of harm to others, and a showing we think very hard to really sustain. I know education is an area in which the NSS are quite active. And again, I would argue that Article 18, while it provides for the rights of parents or legal guardians to raise their children or ward in an education of their choice, there are strict limitations on how far this right will extend. This right has to be balanced with the child's own right to freedom of thought in a manner consistent with the child's evolving capacities. This principle is crucial since it acknowledges that at a certain age, the child shall be free to make their personal choices in matters of thought, matters of religion or belief. There's a debate going on, or there's some activity going on in the UK about how far parents can influence the education of a child. I want to note that the education of a child must also be directed to certain principles, and among which, under international law, there is the preparation of the child for responsible life in a free society in the spirit of understanding, peace, tolerance, equality of sexes, and friendship amongst all peoples, ethnic, national, and religious groups, and persons of indigenous origin. That's Article 29D of the Child Rights Convention, also found similarly in the 81 Declaration as a limit on how far parents can claim their right to raise children or educate children in their beliefs. Let me also talk about common misunderstandings and some features of the core features of phobe. In my work, I find that misconceptions, either willful or not so willful, are plenty. And let me just highlight some of the key ones I come across. The first, of course, is that to assert that this right protects individuals, not ideas, beliefs, or religions. And I can't say it enough because very often it is about people trying to protect an idea. This right includes an extremely broad set of beliefs, including traditional and non-traditional religious beliefs, non-religious beliefs, and new beliefs. So it is anything, essentially, the right to hold that in our minds. It includes a very strict interpretation of limitations. They must always be the exception and must be narrowly construed and should never destroy any part of the right itself. It certainly does not give a license to discriminate. That's not what the right is about. There is an inbuilt claim to equality in the right. It also includes the freedom not to manifest a belief and certainly freedom from religion. Now, last March, the UN Human Rights Council, in the interactive dialogue I had with member states and other observers organizations, a delegation, it's an open meeting, so it was a Vatican delegate, disputed that freedom from religion is covered by international law. And here's what he said. Of the utmost concern, the use of the term freedom from religion, which is not contemplated in the international instruments, reveals a patronizing idea of religion going beyond the mandate of Special Rapporteur. I, of course, had to respond to this by saying, in fact, there can be no meaningful right of freedom of religion unless there was a right to freedom from religion as well. And another subject of importance to the NSS, the name gives it the clue, desecularization. In the Western political debate, we see an increased number of questions concerning the space that religion should occupy in society. According to some scholars, this is a consequence of migration movements, or rather to the arrival in Western societies of people whose religious beliefs have not gone through an historical process of secularization in the countries of origin. Yet, if you look at many countries, UK for instance, some have observed that the majority of legal cases requesting exemptions from laws of general applicability are being advanced not by minority or migrant groups, but by established religious traditions. Protecting freedom of religion or belief in contexts in which the principles of state neutrality and separation between religion and state are under threat is remarkably challenging. Indeed, even though international law does not prescribe a specific form of relationship between state and religion, the analysis of worldwide restrictions of freedom of religion or belief has shown that states that identify with religion or states that have a negative view of religion are more propense to violate that right. If you look at my communications database, the bulk, a majority of the communications are given to sent states which have an official religion or attachment to religion. And the least amount of communications go to states where there is respect for human rights while observing secular traditions. Of course, secularism itself comes in many forms, some of which are more likely to respect fundamental freedoms and are political concern, while others are not. I'm dealing with, on the one hand, China, where there is a serious concern, but I also look at secular societies where there is respect for human rights, where there is a lot more space for equal concern and equal respect. Therefore, I argue that the model of relationship that is best in line with the right to freedom of religion or belief is the one that is in harmony with the concept of respectful distancing and which acts on deep grounding of secularity based on human rights. International law does not say states should be secular, but it's obvious that unless there was a distance between state and religion, there is no space to respect human rights. But also, having that space also means that states should not view religion or just people with hostility as some states do. So to conclude, overall, in reclaiming religious freedom, we need to be mindful of what the UDHR says in its preamble, that the foundation of peace, freedom, and justice in the world is a recognition of the inherent dignity and the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family. And to recall the very first article of UDHR, drafted by Dr. Charles Malik, and I'm putting in modern language here. All humans are born free and equal in dignity and rights. They are endowed with reason and conscience and must act towards each other in spirit of fraternity. So the task ahead of us is as difficult or as simple as the assertion, the constant reaffirmation of being free and equal. Thank you.